I consider myself a pretty optimistic person. I think that based on any reasonable measure you would look at, we live in one of the best periods of time in history. Sure, we have problems. We have climate change, we have social unrest, we still have inequality. But if you so much as cough on a history book, you can see that almost every problem was much worse for pretty much all of our history. And while we do have some unique problems today, some ways that the world is actually worse than it used to be, I really feel like those are so significantly outweighed by all the ways in which it is better. You go back a little over 100 years, and if you get an infection, you kind of die. Right? Like, not guaranteed, but just imagine not having antibiotics, right? There's so many ways the world is better today. To me, one of the craziest things is when I go online and I see people arguing that, oh, how could you bring a child into the world today? The world is so awful. It's so dangerous. It's irresponsible to want to have a kid. And to me, that's such a ludicrous, unfortunate belief to have. It feels like a naive ignorance of how far the world and our species has come over the last 100, let alone 1,000 years. Things are just so much better in general today. But people believe it. Some people are pessimists. I'm not saying they're necessarily wrong, right? People can have very different perspectives, beliefs, ideas on the world. And one of the interesting things about a podcast like this and getting to explore books and reading and trying on new ideas is trying to empathize with some of those beliefs. And so that is part of what we are going to explore today. Should you be a pessimist? Is life ultimately suffering? Is it irresponsible to bring more life into this world if there is going to be that degree of perpetual pain and whatnot? And the way we're going to explore it is through this guy, Arthur Schopenhauer, who is considered one of the most influential philosophical pessimists really ever. And he's somebody whose philosophy and whose work ties in really beautifully with some of the earlier episodes I've done on Straw Dogs by John Gray and Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Nietzsche. You don't need to have listened to them if you're interested. At the end of this episode, you could go back and listen to them. It might send you down a fun rabbit hole, but it's neat how some of these ideas are starting to tie together. So we're going to talk about Schopenhauer's ideas, this concept of the will to live, his philosophical pessimism, and how that applies to finding meaning in life and work, creativity in general. He talks a lot about what it means for learning and expressing yourself, and it's an interesting blend of Western philosophy with some Eastern ideas. So he was very influenced by Kant and Plato, but also by the Upanishads, one of the really seminal works of Eastern Indian, wouldn't necessarily religion, more like philosophy. And I know the topic sounds kind of like a downer, but it really wasn't. It was a very fun and interesting book to read. He's super readable, and he's very quippy. He's funny. He's got a good wit to him. He would do very well, I think, on Twitter today. And so even though the topic is pessimism, you'll still find a lot of interesting ideas and bits to pull out of this, even if you are sort of already with me that pessimism is not the way to look at life. Before we start, I want to let you know about a new sponsor for the podcast, Equip Foods. Equip is a whole food supplement company. And what I like about them is that their founder, Anthony, is one of the most meticulously obsessed people with food quality that I've ever met or even seen online. You probably know, maybe you've listened to episode 1 on what your food ate, but there are a lot of vitamins, nutrients, things like that we just don't get in our diets anymore. Ideally, we wouldn't need to supplement at all. We could just go hunt and forage and get a well-rounded diet from our environment, but we don't do that anymore. And a lot of the foods that we eat are unfortunately deprived of the vitamins, nutrients, things that they would have originally had before industrialized agriculture. So it can be helpful to add some amount of supplementation to our diet, but most supplement companies, unfortunately, have really low quality standards. So they're basically feeding you table sugar and calling it fruit, right? There's a big difference in quality between different companies that you can get supplements from. And so what I like about Equip is that they do these whole food supplements and they do the best sourcing possible. So they're a little more expensive, but you're getting like a lot more bang for your buck. In particular, I take their beef liver capsules basically every day. I know that organ meat is one of the most nutrient-dense foods you can eat, but I really don't want to eat liver every day. It's kind of gross. And so what they've actually done is taken grass-fed beef liver, freeze-dried it, ground it up, and put it in capsules. And so I just take those every day. And out of basically any supplement I've taken, it's the one that I notice the most when I forget to take it. It has the biggest impact on my sense of well-being day to day. So I literally take that basically every day when I'm not traveling. So I reached out to them and they're giving Nat's Notes listeners 15% off. You can go to equipfoods.com/Nat or just use the coupon code NAT at checkout. And if beef liver isn't your thing, they also have a collagen chocolate powder. So collagen is like a type of protein that you usually get in mostly, I think, organs and like bone marrow and other parts of the animal that, again, we don't eat very much anymore. And I'll often have that as breakfast too. It's really, really good. Highly recommend checking them out. You can just go to equipfoods.com/Nat and you'll get 15% off that first order. And as always, anybody that I include as a sponsor is only going to be a company that I personally like and use. And I really do use this product every single day. So definitely check it out. All right, on to Schopenhauer. Now, Schopenhauer was born in 1788 in Poland. He died in 1860 in Germany. So he lived during this very interesting period of Western Europe philosophy, especially metaphysics, ethics, and dealing with some of the decline in Christianity and reestablishing our values, our metaphysics, how we see and view the world without just abdicating all of that thinking to religion, which had been happening for most of post-Roman history in the West up until the Renaissance. And to understand where some of his pessimism comes from, it helps to understand some of his metaphysics. So we're going to explore that a little bit. Now, if you're not familiar with the term, metaphysics is basically the philosophy of the world and reality, right? So physics is actual gravity and light and the rules of the universe. And metaphysics is more about our perception of the physical world. What is this relationship between the software, hardware that we have running up in our brain and the actual world around us? Do we see the world as it really is? What is the difference between the world as it is and our interpretation of it? Is there a real world out there, or are we just brains in vats imagining a world? Or these are questions that have existed for all of time. And on the one hand, they are to a certain degree useless, for lack of a better word. I'm not the biggest fan of metaphysics because there's kind of this sense of, okay, well, what's the point, right? Like, I'm going to go out and eat and hang out with my friends and play with my kids anyway. It doesn't matter if that world doesn't really exist. If I'm just a brain in a vat, I'm going to keep living anyway. But it's interesting to consider, and Schopenhauer's ethics and some of the ideas around his pessimism are very influenced by his metaphysics, by his interpretation of the world around us. We'll talk through his metaphysics and how it was influenced, but let me tell you a little bit more about Schopenhauer, the person, first, because he's kind of a weird dude. Now, Schopenhauer was born to a merchant father, and he thought that he would always go into the merchant trade. And so his father's this wealthy merchant. Schopenhauer starts studying in this wealthy high school, and when he turns 18, he goes into being a merchant, working at the shop of somebody who was affiliated with his father. And then a couple of things happen. Basically, right after Schopenhauer turns 18 and starts working, his father dies, and he leaves a fortune of a certain amount, and it's held by Schopenhauer's mother for now, who kind of abandons him, goes off and marries another guy, starts spending all of the money, and a lot of animosity develops there. And Schopenhauer feels like he has to do this merchant job because he promised his father before he died, but he starts working and he realizes that working life isn't all that it's cut out to be. And this is from the introduction to the Penguin Classics edition of the Essays and Aphorisms of Schopenhauer. So he says that what Schopenhauer realized at this time is that for the great majority, a job is, depending on temperament, a torment or a tedious irrelevance, which has to be endured day after day in order that during one's so-called free time, one will be allowed to get on with living. They know that short of a total revolution in the conduct of human affairs, any conceivable social order will, for the great majority, mean the boredom of routine, the damming up of their natural energies, and the frustration of their natural desires. And he says that this feeling is what overcame Schopenhauer as he stepped into the working world. He started doing this merchant job. And remember, he's like a rich kid. he's got like a great setup. He's got this great job. He went to this great school. He's going to inherit this fortune. And he's starting this work and he's looking around and saying, is this all there is? Is this life? And it creates this horrible malaise where he says, this feels so pointless. And you have to chuckle a little bit, right? It's sort of like the classic spoiled rich kid of, like, oh my God, I have to work? Like, this sucks. Guys, come on. I feel like you see this on social media and Reddit kind of often now, where somebody starts their internship and they go, can't somebody just like give me money, right? And that's a little bit of his attitude. And so he does a couple of years in merchant school and then quits to go to university and study literature and try to go down this more contemplative thinking philosopher route. And once he starts his new life as a philosopher, it takes off really quickly. So he's in his early 20s when he starts studying. And by 28, he's basically come up with his whole philosophy that will define his work for the rest of his life. And the weird thing with Schopenhauer is that a lot of philosophers go through many evolutions of their ideas over time. Their ideas change as they get older, maybe they get more refined, maybe they abandon things from their youth. Not Schopenhauer. He comes up with this stuff by 28 and then basically never changes it. So the stuff that we're reading from today are his essays and aphorisms, which he wrote later on in his life. His original and most influential book was The World as Will and Representation, but those ideas didn't really change. And when I was doing the research for what to cover in this podcast, a lot of people suggested reading this instead because he gets it just a little tighter as he gets older. And it deviates into more areas here. Now, the crazy thing is that this book will go on to be incredibly influential. Schopenhauer is a very household name if you've dipped your toe into philosophy at all. But after he publishes it, nobody reads it. Nobody hears about it for 32 years. And this whole time, he is convinced his day is coming. He knows that people are going to find this and recognize him for the genius that he is. And they eventually do. But from 28 until he's 60, nobody cares, which is just an insane commitment to these ideas. And he doesn't even publish very much else during that. He is a weird dude. All right, let me just read you some of the stuff about his life and his routines to get a sense of the tough-headedness, the steadfastness to his obsessions. So a couple of years after his father dies, he has this fortune he's waiting to inherit. It's being held by this bank. The bank basically goes bankrupt. And they tell everyone that you can have 30% of your deposits back. And he kind of throws a fit and gets into this massive legal battle with them, fights them for 2 years. Every single other creditor says, okay, yeah, fine, we'll take 30%, except for Schopenhauer. He keeps hammering on this bank. He's eventually rewarded for it. From the introduction, they say, while every other creditor finally settled for 30%, he persisted in refusing and at length received back the full amount due to him. But that wasn't enough for him. He also got the accumulated interest from the 2 years of having to wait to get his money back. He was willing to just fight to get back what he thought he was due. And this is kind of reflected in his 32-year wait for his book to take off. He just knew that if he was focused enough, he would get his way eventually. But then kind of as a foil to that, he's really an all-or-nothing guy. So in 1820, he started teaching a lecture on philosophy in Berlin. But he decided to teach his lecture at the exact same time as Hegel, who was a much more influential philosopher at the time. And so the university says, hey, maybe teach it at a different time. People come and say, no, it's going to be at the same time. Nobody shows up to his lectures. So his class fails. And then after a year, he just gives up and quits being a professor and never tries again. So again, you've got this crazy obsession with it. It's my way or the highway. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And then the other really great example of just how steadfast he was in this resolve is that from the age of 45 until his death 27 years later, Schopenhauer lived in Frankfurt. He lived alone in rooms, so in a hotel, and every day for 27 years, he followed an identical routine. He rose every morning at 7 and had a bath, but no breakfast. He drank a cup of strong coffee before sitting down at his desk and writing until noon. At noon, he ceased work for the day and spent half an hour practicing the flute, on which he became quite a skilled performer. Then he went out for lunch at the Englischer Hof. Apparently, he went to lunch at the same place every single day for 27 years. After lunch, he returned home and read until 4 when he left for his daily walk. He walked for 2 hours no matter the weather. And there are apparently all these stories of him walking in insane rainstorms and snow and crazy heat. No matter what, he got his 2-hour walk in. He had insane results. Then in the evening, he would attend the theater or a concert, after which he had dinner at a hotel or a restaurant. He got back home between 9 and 10 and went early to bed. He was willing to deviate from this routine in order to receive visitors, but with this exception, he carried it through for 27 years. So this is really the theme of his life, is he had this idea about how to live really in his early 20s, and then he stuck with it until he died. And I think it's interesting to read some of this stuff about who he was as a person, because it makes you think about some of the ideas that we'll talk about, some of the pessimism and how it might have influenced those ideas and how those ideas might have influenced his lifestyle. And to me, at least, I look at some of this and I think about some of his ideas and I think to myself, I'm not sure I want to be this person. I'm not sure I want this person's ideas, right? You might have heard the version of this concept with, you can't be jealous of someone unless you would trade your life with them. Well, I think you also can't really adopt somebody's philosophy unless you're willing to adopt the lifestyle that goes with it. And one question might be, if you look at the world this way, does that lead you to this kind of life? And some people might love the crazy obsessive routine and never deviating from it. I think that sounds like torture, but it's neat to see how he actually lived some of these ideas. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about his metaphysics, because I said that was going to be important, and I'll be honest, if the idea of metaphysics and philosophy is just super boring to you, you can totally skip ahead to the next chapter. It should be down in the description below. But I think it's worthwhile to get a little bit of this history, because philosophy does develop from person to person. No philosopher really just sits in a room and comes up with something from scratch. They're always influenced by the people who came before them, the people in their time period. And Schopenhauer's main influences were Plato, Kant, and the Upanishads. Plato kind of being the original big philosopher that we have to draw on. Kant being the recent, very influential philosopher. Kant lived about 50 years before Schopenhauer. They overlapped, but Kant was born about 50 years earlier, I think. And he was really like the creme de la creme, the big influential thinker of the day. And then the Upanishads provided some balance to some of these ideas. They provided some of the answer of how to live, given the beliefs about the world that Schopenhauer developed. And the interesting thing with him is he was really the first Western philosopher to identify with and to bring in Eastern philosophy. There was much less of a recognition of the impact of Eastern philosophy at the time until Schopenhauer, who comes along and says, hey, we can really integrate a lot more of these ideas into our understanding of the world. They really flush it out. So he was kind of progressive in that sense. Now, Kant's metaphysics is notoriously complicated. It's very hard to parse. And Schopenhauer actually argued that he was the only person who really understood Kant in his day. And if you've ever tried to read any of Kant's metaphysics, it's super painful. But the important thing to understand is that at the gist of Kant's metaphysical arguments was that there is a real world out there, which we don't know, and then there is our mental representation of it. There is the real world and there is the apparent world. And we can never fully understand the real world, but we can make judgments about it. We can try to synthesize information about it based on our experiences, based on the information that we collect. You might have heard the terms like a priori and a posteriori. A priori might be things that we can just know without experience. A posteriori are things that we learn from experience. And Kant kind of separated the world into these two aspects of reality. And this couch is a thing in the real world, but my mental representation of it is distinctly different from the couch itself. We can never have a fully accurate representation of it because the best we can do is form our own synthetic judgment of it based on our experience with it. So Kant kind of breaks up the world like this. And then Schopenhauer basically says that there's this additional layer to it. And this is where things get a little squirrely. But he basically says that, and I'm going to read from the book and then I'll explain a little bit. We know ourselves objectively in the same way as we know all other phenomena, as an object extended in space and time. We know ourselves as body. But we also know ourselves subjectively. We have an inner consciousness of our own existence, and we possess feelings and desires. The inner world Schopenhauer calls will. We know ourselves as will. And thus there follows the single thought, which properly understood, Schopenhauer says, constitutes the whole of his philosophy. My body and my will are one. My body is the phenomenal form of my will. My will is the noumenal form of my body. My body is appearance, my will, thing in itself. And I think when we bring in some of the explanation of why his ideas had such an impact, it helps clarify this. What Schopenhauer was arguing was that there are two layers to this mental landscape of the world. And he's saying that the will is primary, the intellect secondary. Or he's saying that the will is like one layer, and then the intellect is another layer on top of it. So we don't just have this thinking brain, we have a layer below it that is also kind of like having this impact on our thoughts and our representations of the world. And this seems very obvious to us today when I use the terminology that we use today, because what he's actually talking about is that we have a conscious and an unconscious mind. But that was a new idea. Schopenhauer really introduced this idea of an unconscious acting part of our brain and the more conscious thinking part of our brain. And he introduced some of these ideas that actually the unconscious is the one in control. This is from the introduction again. If intellect is the tool of the will, as he says, then human actions are determined not by reason, but by will. Edward von Hartmann translated Schopenhauer's will into the unconscious. We're now so used to the notion that the springs of human conduct are to be sought not in the mind, but in the will, that we have forgotten that this notion had to be invented. And consequently, it was Schopenhauer who invented it. So this is actually a huge change, right? For a lot of history, people thought that they just decided to do things, or they thought that God's willed things, or there wasn't this distinction between our conscious deciding brain and our unconscious secretly controlling brain. But Schopenhauer really introduces that. That's how he sees our perception of the world. We have our thinking ideas about it, and then we have our deeper, more physical sensations, relations, impressions, unconscious perceptions of it. And those are the ones that are actually driving things. And because of that, Schopenhauer argues, we should have this pessimistic outlook that we're going to dive into. Because he's basically saying that the will is this will to live. It is this will to preserve our life at any means necessary. And so whenever our desire to live comes into conflict with the best interests of other people around us, our unconscious mind, our will to live, will always prioritize us over those other people, and that is the root of all suffering in the world. Reading from the introduction again, the hinge of Schopenhauer's philosophy is the ethical assertion that the will is evil and must be denied. Every individual is embodied will, and the nature of will is to strive to live. Will is will to live. This meant that fundamentally every individual is an ego whose interest in staying alive overrides every other, including, of course, the life interest of every other individual. The outcome is universal conflict. So it's this idea that if we're truly just embodied will, that this will to live is driving everything, then we will avoid conflict whenever we can. But as soon as somebody else gets in the way of our desire to live and preserve our life, we will happily ignore their will to live in preference for ours. The suffering engendered by this conflict is the normal and inescapable condition of life. And happiness means merely the diminution of suffering. Happiness is negative. The way out of this circle of suffering lies in denial of the will, refusal to enter the contest. The power to do so is provided by the conscious intellect, which is capable of understanding the nature of the will and its effects, and thus of striving to set them aside. Ultimately, the only real good is extinction. The realization that the perceived universe, the world as idea, is as nothing, the conscious acceptance of the need for annihilation as the only true cure for the sickness of life. And finally, the acceptance of annihilation itself. So he's not explicitly saying that we should just die, but he is saying that death is truly the only full alleviation of suffering, because as long as you are alive, you are suffering in some capacity. And that's how we get to Schopenhauer's pessimism, this pessimistic outlook on life. As he opens this first essay with the suffering, or it's called On the Suffering of the World. If the immediate and direct purpose of our life is not suffering, then our existence is the most ill-adapted to its purpose in the world. For it is absurd to suppose that the endless affliction of which the world is everywhere full, and which arises out of the need and distress pertaining essentially to life, should be purposeless and purely accidental. Each individual misfortune, to be sure, seems an exceptional occurrence, but misfortune in general is the rule. So he's going to argue that our life is just naturally full of suffering. We never really notice or become conscious of what is agreeable to our will. If we are to notice something, our will has to have been thwarted, has to have experienced a shock of some kind. On the other hand, all that opposes, frustrates, and resists our will, that is to say, all that is unpleasant and painful, impresses itself upon us instantly, directly, and with great clarity, just as we are not conscious of the healthiness of our whole body, but only of the little place where the shoe pinches. So we think not of the totality of our successful activities, but of some insignificant trifle or other which continues to vex us. Now, this is something that I think immediately resonates with almost anyone who hears it. You so rarely appreciate all the good things in your life, all the good aspects of your health or the successful things you've done. You naturally focus on the bad things. You focus on what's wrong, on what hasn't gone well. And this seems to be a very fundamental aspect of human psychology. And this is kind of why he's arguing that suffering is the default, because everybody does this. It's interesting that this idea that we are always preoccupied by what we don't have or what we haven't done more than we're preoccupied or thinking about the ways we've succeeded, it shows up in all of philosophy. You can read stuff from 2,000 years ago and they're still talking about this. You can read modern psychology influencers on Twitter and they're talking about this. It is clearly hardwired into us that we do not enjoy what we have or what has gone well for us. We are only fixated on what's wrong. And this is why he's arguing that happiness is negative. Suffering is the default, and happiness is just the brief periods when we are not suffering. And this is what he means by happiness is negative, right? The happiness of a given life is not to be measured according to the joys and pleasures it contains, but according to the absence of the positive element, the absence of suffering. This being so, however, the lot of the animals appears more endurable than that of man. He's going to go on and argue that animals actually have it better because they've created less suffering for themselves, because a lot of our suffering is our own fault. What happens is this: man deliberately intensifies his needs, which are originally scarcely harder to satisfy than those of the animal, so as to intensify his pleasure. Hence luxury, confectionery, tobacco, opium, alcoholic drinks, finery, and all that pertains to them. To these is then added, also as a result of reflection, a source of pleasure, and consequently of suffering available to him alone, and one which preoccupies him beyond all measure, indeed more than all the rest put together: ambition and the sense of honor and shame. In plain words, what he thinks others think of him. This, in 1,000 often curious shapes, then becomes the goal of all those endeavors of his which go beyond physical pleasure or pain. He excels the animal in his capacity for enjoying intellectual pleasures, to be sure, and these are available to him in many degrees, from the simplest jesting and conversation up to the highest achievements of the mind. But as a counterweight to this, on the side of suffering stands boredom, which is unknown to the animals, at least in the state of nature, and is only very slightly perceptible in the very cleverest domesticated ones, while to man it has become a veritable scourge. Want and boredom are indeed the twin poles of human life. So he's demonstrating this very interesting duality in our lives. We want these greater pleasures. We want television and alcohol and all these, very heightened forms of entertainment or enjoyment. But as a consequence of that, we get boredom. We get this sense of lack. We increase our suffering when we aren't having these greater pleasures. And I'm sure you've seen people talk about dopamine fasts and detoxes and all the scientific versions of this today. But it's, again, a very old idea that the more you increase your pleasures, the more you increase the associated pain that comes with them. And Schopenhauer is essentially arguing here that we are drawn to these pleasures. We are drawn to staring at our phone all day and being constantly entertained. And so we are also drawn to the suffering that comes with it. We naturally increase our suffering through our own desires. And so again, there is this sense of, well, life is just, for some strange reason, this natural strive towards increasing the suffering in our lives. So then you have to start to ask, okay, well, what do we do? Right? How do we respond to this? How do we try to reduce the suffering or at least minimize it as much as possible? How do we achieve happiness in the Schopenhauer sense of minimizing suffering? And this is where some of the Eastern mysticism comes in, or Eastern philosophy comes in. I shouldn't say mysticism. And you've certainly heard of like mindfulness meditation, right? Or just trying to be more mindful, trying to live in the present moment and not be as obsessed with worrying or hoping for the future or regretting or reminiscing about the past. And he has kind of an interesting take on that. He says, every moment of our life belongs to the present only for a moment. Then it belongs forever to the past. Every evening we are poorer by a day. We would perhaps grow frantic at the sight of this ebbing away of our short span of time, were we not secretly conscious in the profoundest depths of our being that we share in the inexhaustible well of eternity, out of which we can forever draw new life and renewed time. You could, to be sure, base on considerations of this kind, a theory that the greatest wisdom consists in enjoying the present and making this enjoyment the goal of life, because the present is all that is real and everything else merely imaginary, right? Mindfulness, being present, okay? We've heard this argument before. But you could just as well call this mode of life the greatest folly. For that which in a moment ceases to exist, which vanishes as completely as a dream, cannot be worth a serious effort. So again, we have this pessimism, this, what is the point? Why are you obsessing over the present moment when it's just going to be gone? Right? You might temporarily alleviate your suffering by focusing on it, but suffering is coming back no matter what. It is just as wise to be engaged in the present moment as it is stupid. And part of the problem, Schopenhauer continues, is just how bad we are at appreciating what we have in the present moment. No man is happy, but strives his whole life long after a supposed happiness which he seldom attains, and even if he does, it is only to be disappointed with it. As a rule, however, he finally enters harbor shipwrecked and dismasted. Another thing you've definitely heard before, right? Like the problem with goals and the problem with starting towards things is you get them and you're not really any happier. You reach the mountaintop and you say, as Schopenhauer did, is this all there is? And then you're left wondering, why aren't I happy? Why didn't I get that everlasting satisfaction that I hoped I would get by achieving this? And Schopenhauer says, we know that's going to happen. We know that we can strive for something that will make us happy, we'll get it, and we will be no happier. But we're still going to do it. We're still going to be unhappy in all these moments trying to get to something. And part of that problem, again, is just how bad we are at appreciating the present moment. The scenes of our life resemble pictures in rough mosaic. They are ineffective from close up and have to be viewed from a distance if they are to seem beautiful. That is why to attain something desired is to discover how vain it is, and why, though we live all our lives in expectation of better things, we often at the same time long regretfully for what is past. The present, on the other hand, is regarded as something quite temporary and serving only as the road to our goal. That is why most men discover when they look back on their life that they have the whole time been living ad interim, and are surprised to see that which they let go by so unregarded and unenjoyed was precisely their life, was precisely that in expectation of which they lived. And I want to reread this line because it's so good. That is why most men discover when they look back on their life that they have the whole time been living ad interim, and are surprised to see that which they let go by so unregarded and unenjoyed was precisely their life. This is so powerful. We all do this. We all think, okay, I just got to do this to get to the next thing, right? I'm going to accomplish this and then I'll get this thing and then I'll like work on that next thing, right? Like I'll finish this task to get to the next one. I got to get through this situation, whatever, so I can get to this better situation. The problem is, this is your life, right? Like you are living in these moments. This is the life that you are continually striving for. And if you can't appreciate the moments during which you are striving, then you will certainly not appreciate whatever new thing you are striving to get to, whatever new phase you are striving to get to. You will just once again be stuck in this loop of being unsatisfied. And so it's this really powerful image that you can look back and say, oh, all of those moments that I wasn't appreciating, hoping for a future moment, that was my life, right? Like there was no point where I was suddenly satisfied. I was spending the whole time just looking forward to the next thing instead of appreciating where I was. And it's so hard to do. We are so bad at it. And I'm not sure Schopenhauer even thinks we can do it. He's just saying that this is what we do. And this is another part of the tragedy of life. We can never appreciate the beauty of the moments that we're in because we're always looking forward to the next moment. And going back to boredom, this is really one of those big, unfortunate, sad consequences of boredom, is that boredom is an inability to appreciate that you are living your life in that moment. That is just as much a chunk of your life as whatever future moment you were looking forward to is. It's like when we talked about finite and infinite games last week, that if you're trying to travel somewhere as fast as possible, you are ignoring that the transit is part of the trip itself. If you can't enjoy the transit, then you are not really enjoying traveling, right? That is part of the trip. You have to make as much of that as you can as well. And so if you can't find a way to enjoy and appreciate your life waiting in line at the DMV, then you are not going to enjoy your life when you are in the car either. So he goes on to say, life presents itself first and foremost as a task, the task of maintaining itself. If this task is accomplished, what has been gained is a burden, and there then appears a second task, that of doing something with it so as to ward off boredom, which hovers over every secure life like a bird of prey. Thus, the first task is to gain something, and the second to become unconscious of what has been gained, which is otherwise a burden. This is so perfect, right? If you're focused on trying to pay your bills, feed your family, stay afloat, then you're not going to be as worried about being bored because you're just trying to maintain your life. But as soon as you get that level of wealth, you're suddenly going to start to think, well, what do I do now? And again, like we talked about in finite and infinite games, that's why people who become very wealthy often don't stop working and relax. They need to find some new challenge to go after because they're immediately bored by that life they worked so hard to earn. And this is kind of a dark topic, but it hints at one of the very strange paradoxes of suicide that it seems to be most prevalent in most affluent societies. It's only once your basic needs have been met that you can actually contemplate the meaning of life and if it's a life worth living at all. And that's part of what Schopenhauer is trying to explore here. Is existence worth it, or is life just perpetual suffering? He does offer what seems to be a way out, at least for him, though. As things are, we take no pleasure in existence except when we are striving after something, in which case distance and difficulties make our goal look as if it would satisfy us, an illusion which fades when we reach it, or when engaged in purely intellectual activity, in which case we are really stepping out of life so as to regard it from outside like spectators at a play. Even sensual pleasure itself consists in a continual striving and ceases as soon as its goal is reached. Whenever we are not involved in one or other of these things but directed back to existence itself, we are overtaken by its worthlessness and vanity, and this is the sensation called boredom. So this perpetual mental suffering, this boredom, is just the default state of life. And the only two ways out of it, according to Schopenhauer, are to have something to strive after or to become satisfied in contemplation. He's kind of combining some of the ideas in Gray's Straw Dogs here, where Gray is arguing that we should just be happy with contemplation, with the intellectual life, because perpetual striving will always make us unhappy. Schopenhauer is saying something different, and I find Schopenhauer's argument a little bit more compelling. He's saying that as long as you're always striving, you can actually be happy because we feel happy, or we're at least distracted from suffering when we're striving after something. As long as you don't think that once you arrive at your goal, you'll be happy, you're okay. You have to love the hamster wheel, right? Like one must imagine Sisyphus laughing, or you've got to love pushing the boulder day in and day out, because as soon as you stop and look at it, you're going to go, wait, why am I doing this? So you have to find something to just strive for your whole life to keep you occupied. Or you have to learn how to step back and look at life as an intellectual, as a philosopher, like a spectator at a play, and be satisfied with that kind of life. But those are basically your only two ways out. So you either have this intellectual, this philosophical, this idleness, this appreciation of the world, or you have this activity, this things to strive for. And Schopenhauer does both and talks about both. So let's explore those a little bit. So if you're going to try this contemplative life, as Schopenhauer recommends, then how do you go about it? Well, he has some strong opinions on reading and learning. He has a great essay in here called Thinking for Yourself. As the biggest library, if it is in disorder, is not as useful as a small but well-arranged one, so you may accumulate a vast amount of knowledge, but it will be of far less value to you than a much smaller amount if you have not thought it over for yourself. Because only through ordering what you know by comparing every truth with every other truth can you take complete possession of your knowledge and get it into your power. You can only know what you have thought about. And this is a theme that is going to come up a lot here, where he's very critical of people who just read and read and read and accumulate tons of knowledge, but aren't doing anything with it, particularly aren't thinking about it. And this might be the difference between somebody who's super academic and can quote a lot of stuff from books, but doesn't have that many ideas of their own. He says the result is that much reading robs the mind of all elasticity, as the continual pressure of a weight does a spring, and that the surest way of never having any thoughts of your own is to pick up a book every time you have a free moment. The practice of doing this is the reason erudition makes most men duller and sillier than they are by nature and robs their writings of all effectiveness. They are, in Pope's words, forever reading, never to be read. So as a reminder, Schopenhauer basically only used 3 sets of texts to influence a lot of his work. He obviously read other stuff, but he was very heavily drawing on Plato, Kant, and the Upanishads, and he thought that that was enough. He didn't need to go read every single philosophy book. The more important thing was sitting and thinking and working on the ideas yourself, and it's better to work really hard thinking about something than to try to just find the answer in a book. It is only our basic thoughts that possess truth and life, for only these do we really understand through and through. The thoughts of another that we have read are crumbs from another's table, the cast-off clothes of an unfamiliar guest. It goes on and says that reading is merely a surrogate for thinking for yourself. It means letting someone else direct your thoughts. You should read only when your own thoughts dry up, which will, of course, happen frequently enough, even to the best heads. That's an interesting way to think about it, right? Like, as long as you're having ideas, as long as you're being productive and thinking and grappling with stuff, then maybe you shouldn't be reading too much, because you're just going to keep piling weight on the spring. It's never going to be able to boing back, right? It's easy to get stuck just reading and reading and reading and never doing anything with it. And the ideas that come from your own head are going to be much more valuable than ideas that you find somewhere else. And there's an order there too, where he thinks it's better to think about the world and come up with ideas and then try to find other explanations of those ideas in books. The man who thinks for himself becomes acquainted with the authorities for his opinions only after he has acquired them and merely as a confirmation of them, while the book philosopher starts with his authorities in that he constructs his opinions by collecting together the opinions of others. His mind then compares with that of the former as an automaton compares with a living man. This is what determines the difference between a thinker and a mere scholar. And he gets really savage here. He says that people who pass their lives in reading and acquire their wisdom from books are like those who learn about a country from travel descriptions. They can impart information about a great number of things, but at bottom they possess no connected, clear, thorough knowledge of what the country is like. So again, kind of like finite and infinite games. If you're just collecting information about a subject, but not thinking it through on your own, you're always going to have a fractured view of it. And the one other thing he says on this topic that I thought was really interesting is he says that you should write down valuable ideas that occur to you as soon as possible. We sometimes forget even what we have done, so how much more what we have thought. On the other hand, it is better not to copy down what we have received finished and complete from without, what we have merely learned and what can in any case be discovered again in books. For to copy something down is to consign it to forgetfulness. If, for example, you cannot call something to mind, a line of poetry or a word perhaps, you should not go and look it up in a book, but periodically plague your memory with it for weeks on end until your memory has done its duty. So a very interesting perspective on like note-taking and knowledge capture, right? He's saying that when you read something, you shouldn't take notes on it. All right, so if you hate that I'm doing this with this book, because you're going to forget it, and you shouldn't try to save the finished thoughts of others. The only thing you should be saving are your thoughts so that you can continue to workshop them. And because it's so easy to forget things as you think them, that if you don't write them down, they'll often just disappear. And part of what this feeds into is his philosophy on how to learn, right? So not just related to reading, but like how do you learn in general, and what does this mean for school and education? Before we get to that, if you're enjoying the show, I would love it if you recommended it to a friend. That's the best way for the show to grow. If you already recommended it to a friend, then please give it a like or subscribe on YouTube, give it a review on iTunes or Spotify, wherever you're listening to it. It'll just really, really help more people find it and really help me keep doing this show. So thank you. Okay. So what does he say about learning? If you couldn't guess, he really doesn't like the university system. When you see the many and manifold institutions for teaching and learning, and the great crowd of pupils and masters which throngs them, you might think the human race was much occupied with wisdom and insight. But here too, appearance is deceptive. The latter teach to earn money and strive not for wisdom, but for the appearance of it and to be credited with it. The former learn not to achieve knowledge and insight, but so as to be able to chatter about them and give themselves airs. Now we have to wonder a little bit if there's like a sour grapes element here, because remember, he tried to be a university professor. He tried to teach. He chose the worst time slot possible. Nobody came to his class, and then he quit after a year. So reading this, it fits with the rest of his philosophy. It fits that this is how he thinks about it, but there's also an element of, okay, maybe you're just pissed that nobody came to your class, right? Students and learned men of every kind and every age go as a rule in search of information, not insight. They make it a point of honor to have information about everything. It does not occur to them that information is merely a means towards insight and possesses little or no value in itself. When I see much of these well-informed people I know, I sometimes say to myself, oh, how little such a one must have had to think about since he has so much time for reading. So we come back to this dichotomy, right? Where if you're always reading, never to be read, right? There's a point where you're taking in way too much information that you just can't reasonably do anything with it. And he says that there is actually a better way to learn, that the university system does this like completely backwards. And this is something I actually really strongly agree with. He says, in accordance with the nature of our intellect, concepts ought to arise through abstraction from our perceptions. Consequently, perception should precede concept. If this has in fact happened, as it has in the case of the man whose own experience is his only book and teacher, then he knows quite well what perceptions belong to which of his concepts and are represented by them. We may call this natural education. So this is learning in the wild, going out, having experience, figuring things out as you go, pulling in bits of information as you need them to solve problems, but having a very well-rounded understanding of things because you have actually experienced them. In the case of artificial education, on the contrary, the head is, through lectures, teaching and reading stuffed full of concepts before there is any wide acquaintanceship with the perceptual world at all. Experience is then supposed to supply the perceptions to fit these concepts. Up to that time, however, they have been wrongly applied, and things and men consequently wrongly judged, wrongly seen, wrongly dealt with. So it happens that education produces wrong-headedness, and that is why in youth, after much reading and learning, we go out into the world in part naive, in part confused, and conduct ourselves in it now with arrogance, now with timidity. Our heads are full of concepts which we are now endeavoring to apply, but which we almost always apply wrongly. I just love that, because this is 150 years old. It's the exact same problem with education that we see today, that it just really doesn't prepare you that much for the real world. If you're doing law or medicine or something, like bits of it might be useful, but do business classes teach you how to do business? No, you have to actually go do that. Same with a lot of engineering, with programming, right? You learn so much more by doing the thing and pulling in information as it's needed, instead of just studying a bunch of random concepts and hoping that they're useful to experiences later. And related to these ideas of reading and learning, he has some strong opinions on whose writing you should read as well. It's not just how many books, but the quality of the writing. He says, there are above all two kinds of writer: those who write for the sake of what they have to say, and those who write for the sake of writing. The former have had ideas or experiences which seem to them worth communicating. The latter need money, and that is why they write, for money. They think for the purpose of writing. You can recognize them by the fact that they spin out their ideas to the greatest possible extent, that their ideas are half-true, obscure, forced, and vacillating, and that they usually prefer the twilight so as to appear what they are not, which is why their writing lacks definiteness and clarity. You can soon see they are writing simply in order to cover paper. And as soon as you do see it, you should throw the book down, for time is precious. Only he who writes entirely for the sake of what he has to say writes anything worth writing. So he would have a lot of strong opinions about like pop nonfiction today, right? Or these business writers who seem to write 5 books on basically the same topic, many of which could have been a blog post, right? They're writing simply to cover paper. And according to Schopenhauer, those books are not worth your time. And that's why we don't talk about those books on this podcast. And he really doesn't like the news and journalists. He says, every writer writes badly as soon as he starts writing for gain. A multitude of bad writers lives exclusively on the stupid desire of the public to read nothing but what has just been printed, the journalists. All newspaper writers are, for the sake of their trade, alarmists. This is their way of making themselves interesting. What they really do, however, is resemble little dogs who, as soon as anything whatever moves, start up a loud barking. It is necessary, therefore, not to pay too much attention to their alarms, and to realize in general that the newspaper is a magnifying glass, and this only at best, for very often it is no more than a shadow play on the wall. And so aside from the news, which he obviously really doesn't like, and writers who just write for money, the other type of writing he says to avoid are writers who write without thinking. They write from memory, from reminiscence, or even directly from other people's books. This class is the most numerous. So he's talking about people who write a book just by like quoting ideas from other books or from other people. They don't have many of their own ideas in there. They're just kind of hodgepodging a bunch of material together into a new book, kind of like creating a magazine mosaic of ideas. And he's saying like, those really aren't worth reading. He would probably say, and this is something that's echoed in like Stoic writing too, that you should just go to the source. Instead of reading people who are reinterpreting earlier people's works, just go read the original works. And I tend to agree with that too, because they're often not that hard to read. And then you're getting a much more accurate view of what's being said. And you can make your own interpretations of it as you see fit. So then the last part of this idea around writing, reading, learning, artistic creation actually brings in a little bit of the metaphysics again, right? Where if you want to create your best work, he actually argues that you have to recognize this duality of conscious and unconscious mind. He says that everything primary and consequently everything genuine in man works as the forces of nature do, unconsciously. What is passed through the consciousness thereby becomes an idea. Consequently, the expression of it is to a certain extent the communication of an idea. It follows that all the genuine and proved qualities of the character and the mind are primarily unconscious, and only as such do they make a deep impression. What man performs unconsciously costs him no effort, and no effort can provide a substitute for it. It is in this fashion that all original conceptions, such as lie at the bottom of every genuine achievement and constitute its kernel, come into being. Thus, only what is inborn is genuine and sound. If you want to achieve something in business, in writing, in painting, in anything, you must follow the rules without knowing them. and this is kind of the idea that I think we'll end on and that ties a lot of those other ideas together, is that what you're looking for in something you're reading, learning, writing, doing, something you're feeling, saying, is this genuine expression of will, this true alignment with your body, with your unconscious mind. And that's where your best work, that's where a lot of your truth and your honesty are going to be. Where you need to be wary is when it seems like you're dealing with these more conscious, controlled, manipulated ideas. These writers who are writing for money, this art that is meant to entice and excite you, these things that are not full, genuine expressions. And so Schopenhauer really believes in looking for that deeper unconscious act in whatever it is you're doing or exploring. So, we started on this pessimism topic, right? Like, is life suffering? Is just the world this will to live? And does that pollute all our interactions? And that part, I feel like I had a harder time with. I just don't totally agree that it's that black and white. It's kind of like Hobbesian, right? The world would just be a war of all against all if we removed government. Schopenhauer actually has a similar line in here that I didn't read, but where he argues that if we were delivered into a utopia where we didn't have any struggles anymore, it would actually be hell on earth. We would be miserable and we would start killing each other because we wouldn't know what to do without something to struggle with. Life is this struggle, is this suffering. And to some extent, I think it's true, but it also doesn't necessarily imply the kind of deep pessimistic outlook that it feels like Schopenhauer has. That said, it does feel like where he arrives from that you either have to choose something to strive for, a big goal project, thing that you can continually renew the far goalpost for in your life so that you always have something you're struggling against. That feels deeply true. Or you can find a way to fully immerse yourself in the world of ideas, of contemplation, of trying to see the world as it is, like a audience member at a show. And if you can do both, that's wonderful. But if you can only do one, that's fine too. I think that his take on it is a little more nuanced than Gray's, who felt like he was arguing that we should all just learn how to be contemplative philosophers and enjoy idleness. And I think that's just too big of an ask. I think we like doing things. I like doing things. I'm not sure that I would want to try to force myself into a life of idleness, but recognizing that achieving your goals won't make you happy, that there will not be any point that you get to where you're eternally satisfied. And so you have to learn to appreciate the struggle, right? You have to imagine Sisyphus laughing. Maybe I should do that book too. You have to embrace that and recognize it and always have that thing to strive for and be okay with it and not end up wasting your life ad interim waiting to get to the next thing. That message I find very powerful and very compelling. So if you want more, definitely pick up the Essays and Aphorisms of Schopenhauer. It is very readable. It's quick. I enjoyed it quite a bit. If you're enjoying the show, please send it to a friend. That is the best way to support it. Or like and subscribe on YouTube, leave a review on iTunes, Spotify, anywhere. All of that stuff is super helpful. If you want to say hi, you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Nat Eliason, or Instagram at Nat_Eliason. And I'm most active on both of those. Aside from all that, thank you so much for listening, watching, enjoying the show. I'm loving doing this. I'm really happy that you all are enjoying this too. It's been a lot of fun for me. And I'll see you next time.